Uh, a very warm welcome, everybody, to our first 2022 session of the Populism Seminar. A very happy new year to all of you we haven't seen so far. I really hope that everybody had a good start to the new year, and of course that it shall be a little bit less bad than the last two. I guess it can only get better. But we're very, very excited to kick off the Populism Seminar again. And of course, as you know, the Populism Seminar is a joint initiative by André Zaslow and Maurits Meyer from Radboud University, Robert Hooper from the University of Salzburg, and myself, Annika Werner, from the Australian National University. And today we have two really exciting presentations by Laura Jacobs from the Université Libre de Bruxelles and from Miku Matsunaga from the University of Tokyo. But before we start with this, I just want to say two quick things. One is that I'm going to talk a little bit more about this at the very end of the session, but I just want to kind of alert you to it that we have the call open for presentations for our spring session that is going to run from March to June. So if you want to present in our seminar here, do apply and go to our home page and submit your abstract. And of course, just some brief house rules. Those of you who've been here before know them. Of course, we are recording this session, and I'm going to put it onto our YouTube channel afterwards. And after the two presentations by Laura and Miku, you, the audience, are of course more than welcome and more than encouraged to ask questions, give your comments and your insights. And there are two ways for you to do this. You can either write them into the Q&A section, where we will then basically take them up and read them out for you. But you can also raise your hand, and then we can unmute you and give you the opportunity to speak, and also to open your video if you would like, and to ask your question in person. But that is all that I wanted to say for now, and I'm really happy to see all of you here, and to now hand over to Laura for her presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Annika, for that introduction, and I will now share my screen. Please let me know if it works or if it doesn't work.
We can see the slides very well.
Okay, perfect. So again, thank you very much for your introduction, Annika, and also thank you, of course, in general, for inviting me to present here today, because indeed during this pandemic situation, these opportunities are more scarce than before. And I'd like to benefit from this opportunity to present ongoing work on mainstream parties' claims on ruling with populist parties, which is a project that I've started recently. So I started last year. And I'll first start by saying that this is indeed part of a broader project or a broader research agenda that I'm currently working on, which is entitled Costs and Benefits of Including or Not Including Populist Parties in Government for Voters. And is indeed engaged as well with the literature on populism, also mainstreaming of populism, and of the increasing tendency that we see populist parties gaining office or being in power. And there is indeed already a very much vibrant field and a lot of new studies that are indeed tapping into all type of related works on populist in governments, but also the consequences of that, for instance, for policy, for incumbency records, but also the consequences for democracy, and also more specifically in relationship, of course, to what this means for mainstreaming populism and the normalization of populism. My focus in this research field is mostly to focus on the rhetoric and the claims that are being used by mainstream parties, actually adopting a political communication perspective, where I try to take stock of what type of arguments that mainstream parties use. And also in the later step, I will also assess the ramifications of these claims on voters, for instance, on electoral support, but also on political attitudes, such as political trust, etc. So as an introduction, as we all know, of course, mostly because I think most people are indeed doing research on populism, but populist parties have indeed performed well at elections in most Western European countries, or in many Western European countries. But this has resulted in some sort of paradox, because we see that indeed this success for these populist parties does not automatically translate in government participation, although we have recently seen, of course, more populist parties entering the government, but still there is still this mismatch. And there can be many reasons for this, but two main reasons can, of course, be linked to the coalition preferences of both the populist parties and, of course, also the mainstream parties. So it could be that populist parties are not willing to rule, or it could also be that mainstream parties are, for various reasons, also not willing to rule with populist parties. Of course, this is something we cannot really fully know what the exact reasons or motivations are, but my focus for this project that I will present today is how mainstream parties articulate their preferences and which type of motivations do they use to either motivate inclusion. So in the rare cases where we do see that they decide to rule with populist parties, but these cases are becoming more widespread recently, and also which reasons do they use to motivate the exclusion of populist parties. So this will be my focus here. So the main research question that I have is, which claims on ruling with populist parties do mainstream parties invoke? And also, how do these claims differ or depend on party characteristics, such as the size or the ideology or the incumbency status of mainstream parties, and also the context? And the idea is to come to some sort of typology of claims, or at least assess if we can come to such a typology. This typology is mostly based on literature on coalition formation theories, and more specifically the policy, office, and vote triad, which actually basically states that parties strive to maximize policy implementation, but also maximization of power in office, and also vote maximization. And that's also, they make this trade-off while deciding to rule, or with which parties to rule, and when to join a government. So this is the assumption that this underlies their decisions. Again, as I said, this is really a political communication perspective. So I do a claims analysis of the claims that mainstream parties adopt. It's also a comparative project where I compare across parties, countries, but also longitudinally, I assess evolution over time. And indeed, the attempt is also to really look explicitly at how party characteristics play a role, but also how certain context variables play a role. Okay, then I want to, Then in terms of case selection, as I mentioned already, so it's a comparative project. And in my project, I look at 5 political contexts, but 4 countries. So Austria, Belgium, both Wallonia and Flanders, Germany and the Netherlands, which means that I assess the claims of 25 mainstream parties. So the Green parties, conservative parties, liberal parties, socialist parties in these countries. Case selection is mostly inspired by the fact that they have similar media systems, but also similar political systems. So they all have, of course, a viable populist party, both from the left and right, except for in Austria, where they only have a radical right populist party. Also, they all tend to have a proportional electoral system, coalition governments, etc. But of course, what makes it so interesting is that they do have different experiences or different past rules regarding ruling with populist parties. So we have cases where populist parties have not governed before, such as in Belgium and Germany, and where they also have this militant democracy tradition with the cordon sanitaire, for instance, that is being enforced in Belgium. Then we have the Netherlands, where populist parties have in the past either joined the government or formally supported a minority government. And then we have Austria, where indeed populist parties have indeed been part of the government before. In terms of time frame, as I said, it's a longitudinal study. So I focus on the claims that they made on Twitter, and that therefore I use the date where Twitter was founded, which is in March 2006. And it goes until May 1, 2021. And in this way, I also cover various elections in all of these countries, and also the government negotiation talks that follow these elections. It's claims analysis, meaning that I conducted a quantitative content analysis of the claims or the tweets, which are the units of analysis, of the mainstream party actors. So both the Twitter accounts of the party, but also the Twitter accounts of the party president, that was at that time the party president have been analyzed. Indeed, when they dealt with inclusion or exclusion of populist parties from both or at both the left and right spectrum of both the right and ends of the political spectrum in all these 4 countries. And you see all the parties listed here. So in Austria, it's claims about the FPÖ. In Belgium, about the PTB, PvdA in Vlaams Belang. In Germany, it's about Die Linke and AfD. And then in the Netherlands, the SP, Forum for Democracy, and the PVV. And this all resulted in 1,919 tweets that I have analyzed that all deal with this inclusion or exclusion, which were done by 20, or which were made, claims made by 25 parties, meaning that's also the full population that I'm studying. Just for you to have an idea of how I've done this, I'm not going to go in too much detail, but these are some of the examples of the tweets that have been eligible to quote from the different cases regarding inclusion and exclusion. Okay, then let's just quickly move to results. So some general observations first. So what is becoming evident is that most of the claims about inclusion or exclusion of populist parties from governments are being articulated in Austria and Germany. So in those countries, this is really the most salient issue, especially if we compare it to the Netherlands and Belgium. We also see that most of the claims deal with radical right-wing populist parties, and also only a minority refer to left-wing populist parties. So 13.9% are about left-wing populist parties, and 86.1 are about or referring to radical right populist parties. We also see in terms of the actors that make these claims that it's mostly center right-wing parties that make those claims. So conservative parties, liberal parties, Christian Democrat parties in all of these countries. And also importantly, if we look at, are they more likely to either motivate inclusion or exclude these parties, or include these parties, or at least, the claims that they make about it, we see that exclusion claims are indeed much more prevalent. So in 91.5% of the cases, they actually mention that they are not willing to rule with the populist party, and only in 8.5% they report that they are willing to rule with populist parties. So overall, there's a large reluctance of mainstream parties to rule with populist parties. Here you can also see an evolution over time in the claims that are being made. So the general claims that are being made on ruling with populist parties or not. So not yet the type of claims that are being made. But indeed, you see, of course, that it's very much situated around election periods. So before or after the election, we see that many of these claims are being made, but not exclusively. So you do see that in some countries, this is really also just a general debate that also pops up apart from election periods. But we do see that in some countries, there's also a clear upward trend. Making clear that this debate on ruling with populist parties is becoming more prevalent over time. Of course, we have 2020 and 2021, which are COVID years. So that is still to be seen how this would evolve, of course, in the future. Then in terms of the types of claims that are being made, so that's, of course, one of the most interesting parts. So, okay, if they refer to the fact that they don't want to rule with the populist party, or that they do want to rule with the populist party, which are actually the motives, the exact justifications that they use for this. And quite interestingly, what we find is that for the exclusion, or what I find is that for the exclusion and the inclusion claims, they make use of different types of arguments. So more generally, what we see is that for the exclusion claims, it's mostly policy-based claims or policy-oriented claims, such as referring to the fact that, the party and the party program is incongruent or ideologically too far or too distant from the own program. And of course, also references to alleged extremism of a party. So for the exclusion claims, if they motivate this, they mostly use these policy-based claims, followed by office-oriented claims, which are claims indeed about, if they join the government, for instance, stability of the government or the reliability of the party, etc. So there we see that is also used quite often for exclusion, but to a lesser extent than policy-based claims. And then we also see that there are vote-seeking motivations, referring to the fact that they respect, that there is a tendency to respect the voter signal or not, which could be a reason to motivate exclusion, because they say, but we still have a majority, still the majority of the voters did not vote for that party, so we can still make a government without them, for instance. But we see that this is really used to a less of an extent than the policy and office-seeking claims. Interestingly, for the inclusion claims, we see that the first two types of motivations, so office seeking and policy seeking, are reversed. So there we indeed see that if they want to motivate why they prefer to rule with the populist party, they mostly point to office seeking claims. For instance, saying, okay, but we need a stable performant government, which means that we should be open to any type of party. And for instance, if a populist party has a lot of votes, this will allow for a strong majority, for instance. They also refer to the fact that there were no other alternatives, etc. So there we indeed see that these office-seeking claims are more important. The policy-seeking claims are still invoked here, but to a lesser extent. So here then, of course, they refer to the fact mostly that, okay, they have the same views on certain issues, for instance, that there is indeed to a certain extent ideological congruence. Interestingly, we also see that the vote-seeking reasons are also much more important here. So for instance, they often say, they refer to the fact, okay, but we need to include the populist party because that would be a way to respect the voter signal, because indeed this party is electorally strong. So, we cannot make it, or we cannot justify it anymore to exclude this party, for instance. So that is quite interestingly that we see how these motivations differ for exclusion and inclusion. Then finally, coming to the conclusion, I also try to assess which party characteristics and also which context characteristics shape these claims. And starting with the context, I do see that there are differences between the countries that I studied. So in countries with militant democracy and also formal exclusion mechanisms, such as Germany and also Belgium, so both Wallonia and Flanders, where there is also a formal cordon sanitaire, for instance, we indeed see that generally mainstream parties are less likely to rule or to say they are willing to rule with populist parties in general, but also more likely to use policy-seeking motives that pertain to this perceived extremism to justify the exclusion of populist parties from office. Whereas in the Netherlands and Austria, we see that, and of course, these are countries that have more experience with ruling with populist parties, but there you see that they are actually more likely to invoke these office-seeking motives. So not really referencing to the fact that they are incompatible ideologically, but indeed pointed to the fact that, okay, but we ruled with them before, but this resulted in corruption, or indeed they showed that they cannot rule, or that they are not competent to rule, etc. So that's interesting, a difference between countries. And then in terms of ideology, we also see that mainstream parties are also rather, that the ideology is important, both of mainstream parties, but also of populist parties. And that they also condition the type of motivations that are being used. So mainstream parties are more likely to invoke policy-seeking motives, emphasizing policy or ideological congruence for ideologically closer populist parties. So there is also this relationship between the own ideology and, of course, the ideology of the populist party. And more generally, of course, we see that the ideology of the populist party also plays a role. Namely, mainstream parties are generally more likely to use policy-seeking motives that link to this perceived extremism to exclude right-wing populist parties than left-wing populist parties. Then the incumbency status plays a role. So incumbent mainstream parties are also more likely to invoke office-seeking motives than non-incumbency parties. And then finally, also the party size plays a role. So both of the mainstream party and of the populist party. So larger mainstream parties are again more likely to invoke policy-seeking motives, but less likely to use office-seeking motives. Whereas the size of populist parties also plays a role because we see that that mainstream parties are more likely to use policy-seeking motives on extremism for excluding larger populist parties as opposed to smaller populist parties, and also less likely to use vote-seeking reasons. So generally concluding, what we see from the political communication or the claimed analysis of mainstream parties, that we see that mostly mainstream parties are actually not willing to rule with populist parties, mostly with radical right populist parties, and that they invoke distinct reasons for this linked to the policy, office and vote triad, but that these reasons indeed differ depending on whether it's inclusion or exclusion, and also that party characteristics and also the country context to a great extent also influence the claims that are being invoked. In the future, of course, wish to link this claim analysis also with public opinion, looking at the effects that this exposure to these different claims has on political attitudes or voting behavior, for instance. I also intend to analyze the political communication of the populist parties themselves. And I also, if I would find a way to do this also in terms of funding. Of course, like to do interviews or surveys with party and party leaders, because here I study, of course, the communication and the claims, but yeah, this would be a nice way to complement this political communication and Twitter communication, for instance, with actual party strategies directly from the party leaders. And I will end here, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and suggestions.
Thank you so much, Laura. And yes, if anybody has any comments or questions, please feel free to already put them into the Q&A. But before we get to that, of course, we'll have Miku's presentation, which I'm also very much looking forward to. Miku, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. And let me share my screen. So I hope that everybody can see my screen.
Yes,
so,
we can.
Okay, thank you. So today, I'd like to present about the effect of the radical right populist parties on the defense policy. And this is a co-authoring paper with the Professor Thomas Winton. So our motivation of the paper is based on the question, like, how does the electoral success of the radical right populist parties affect the manifesto of other parties? Of course, there's a rich literature about the effect of the radical right populist parties on their core issues like immigration and economic globalization, blah, blah, blah. But it seems that the mainstream parties have to be defensive in these radical right core issues. However, we do not know much about when it comes to issues that are difficult to handle for the radical right parties. We think that we ask ourselves, do the established parties go on the offensive against radical right populist parties by sharpening their position? So our question is, how does the electoral success of the radical right populist parties affect the established parties' national defense policy positions and the salience? Here, we shed light on the European party's defense policy in response to that radical right success. Because the defense policy splits the ideological platform of the radical right, established parties can take advantage of this opportunity by presenting the stronger positions and the salience of the issue. So there's a rich literature about the radical right parties and their core issues, especially the immigration and the globalization and the anti-establishment. It says that the radical right parties increase the salience of these issues, and in their core domains, radical right parties actually trigger the policy shifts of the mainstream parties. However, for the established parties, it is difficult to handle these issues because the radical right has an issue ownership. So how about the radical right parties and the defense policy? There's actually a lot of variations. Some say that the radical right populist parties prioritize the domestic security issues such as the law and order. And others say that the radical right populist parties are in favor of the military and advocate increased defense spending. But others say that the radical rights actually opposed to the deployment of the military activity. But indeed, there's a significant variation in this policy. So in this paper, we contend that the defense is a kind of the wedge issue that can potentially divide the ideological and the electoral platform of the radical right populist parties. And in the European context, parties are less constrained by the still weak EU structures. So of course, defense is an important issue, but not as the economy. So there's a low risk of harming the coalition participation and losing the moderate voters by presenting the high salience and the sharper positions. So we argue that the established parties exploit the defense issue to pressure the radical right populist parties. So in this paper, we have two kinds of theoretical expectations. First, established parties raise the salience of and adopt more favorable position on European and international defense policy in response to the radical right success. Also, established parties raise the salience of actors that prove difficult for the radical right parties, like the US and Russia. So to examine our hypothesis, we have several empirical strategies. And in this paper, we cover the 27 European countries between 1990 to 2019. And we employ the RDD, Regulation Discontinuity Design. And our focus is a party level study. And because of that, we draw on data from the Manifesto project and the CHESS. So here are our models, non-parametric and the parametric RDD. And variables. Our outcome variable is the national defense position, defense salience, and the salience of Russia and the US respectively. And our learning variable is the seats, parliamentary seats given to the radical right parties. And because we employ the RD design, we have to place the cutoff point, so which is the electoral threshold. And we apply the optimal bandwise. And also, we prepare the set of covariates, which is the East European dummy, cabinet party dummy, and the intervention, like whether the country here participate in a military operation or not. So here are results. In the first section, we examine the position of the national defense policy. And like you see, in the T1 and the T2 phase, both non-parametric and the parametric model returns the significant and positive estimates, which means that the parties take more assertive defense position in the face of the radical right success. However, with regard to the salience of the defense policy, it's positive, but not significant. And with regard to the salience of Russia, we see it's actually positive and significant in both parametric and non-parametric models, which means that in the face of the radical right success, mainstream parties and other parties actually increase the salience of Russia. But with regard to the US, we have a mixed finding. Although in the T1 phase, both estimates are positive, but only non-parametric audit design returned the significant result. And we plot the national defense positions with the figure. And you see that there's a jump between before the radical right success and after the radical right success. And it actually upholds the result of this section. And this is the figures of the salience of Russia and the US respectively. And we see some jump off here. But if you check the values, you will notice that actually the estimate is quite small compared to the position of the national defense policy. And in order to check the robustness of our main models, we did some series of the robustness check, like including the covariates, applied the different bandwise, and we also did the density tests, and we also checked the alternative data and the dependent variable. And because one of the main model is the parametric, we applied a different polynomial order. Our method relies on the Abou-Chadi and Clouds 2020 paper. And in their paper, they actually see the change of the immigration position. But our model, main model, actually sees just like a position, not the change. So we check the robustness of our model by taking the defense position change. And we actually have a similar result. In the face of the radical right success, actually the mainstream parties take more assertive position in defense policy. And we also check our result with the alternative data, which is chess. Basically, the results are the same, but if you look at the salience of the US power in the world affairs, you will realize that it's a little bit like a mixed findings because it's negative and significant. This is difficult to interpret, but we contend that that was because the question was only asked in 2006. And at the moment, the reputation of the US was quite low due to the failure of the Iraqi war. So maybe that can affect this. But other things like the importance of the international security and peacekeeping, which could be equivalent to the position of the defense, and the salience of Russia, they also have a positive and significant estimate. And the final question is, which party reacts to the radical right success more? And we checked the ideology of the parties. And this is the figure. And in the left-hand figure, you will see the effect of the right-wing parties. And actually, there's no effect. But with regard to the left-wing party, they respond more after the success of the radical right populist party. So we can say that the assertive effect was actually driven by the left-wing parties, more likely. Okay, so to conclude, we have two takeaways. So first, in the face of the radical right populist parties' electoral breakthrough, established parties turned the table by taking a more active defense position and raising the salience of Russia and the US. And especially the left-wing parties are more responsive to the electoral success of the radical right populist parties, and the overall effect was driven by the left-wing parties mainly. Okay, so thank you very much for having us, and we are looking forward to your comments and feedbacks.
Okay, thank you very much for the two presentations. So we will now see if there's any questions. I don't see any questions in the chats. So as Annika says, there's two ways you can ask questions. You can put a question in the chat and we can read it, or you could also I can also turn your mic on if you put your hand up. I can also I can turn your mic on and you're allowed to you can ask it through your mic. I don't see any questions, but Robert, you said that you had a question that you'd like to ask.
Yes, indeed, but I saw that Luca.
Just Luca? Oh,
yeah.
He did. Okay. Do you want to get him? We're allowed to talk. Here we go. There you go, Luca. Go ahead. Hi, Luca.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot for these two great talks. I have two questions actually. And the first one, Laura, goes to you. I was just wondering, while you were looking at the different motifs and what's been used for expressing inclusion and exclusion, can we assume that parties can communicate all motifs equally well on Twitter? So for example, I could imagine that it's easier to say, I do this for policy reasons, for example, or because I'm office seeking while communicating inclusion, but for exclusion, it may seem that you would rather say it's about policy than office. So my question basically is, can you communicate all motifs equally well on Twitter? And then I have another question to you, Miku. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about your second main finding, which, if I understand correctly, was that particularly left-wing mainstream parties adapt their positions. And I was wondering, why would that be the case? Wouldn't we expect that right-wing mainstream parties are particularly pressured to adapt to radical right parties? So why would left-wing mainstream parties move? Thank you.
Shall I answer the
question? Yeah.
Yes, so thank you, Luca, for your question. Yeah, and that's indeed a very good remark. So indeed, Twitter as a political communication tool, indeed, are all motives equally used. And indeed, there's something to say for that, because of course, we know that social media, such as Twitter, of course, are more likely, that it really resonates well with news values and whether there's conflict or drama and activity. So in that regard, maybe we could see differences there, that some of the motives are maybe more emphasized or more likely to be emphasized because they are maybe considered to be more acceptable and to be disseminated more on Twitter compared to other motives. Of course, I only studied Twitter so far for this project, so I can, of course, not conclusively answer this, but for another project, I've also included other social media channels, so also Facebook, but then also traditional news media. And what I do see now is that, at least, so I did this only for Belgian case, so only for Vlaams Belang, PTB, and PvdA, so focusing more in depth on that case. So I can only say something pertaining to that case regarding to this question. But there, it's quite interesting to see that actually they do not tend to differentiate that much between different types of media, so traditional media, social media. So that actually you do see that each party has, of course, certain claims that they prefer. So it's mostly the party that conditions which claims they prefer. So for instance, center-right-wing parties will be more likely to use these office-seeking reasons when they're dealing with populist radical right parties, for instance. So it's mostly the party ideology that plays a role here. And there you see that they have the same claim and the emphasis on the same claims on all these different platforms, at least for Vlaams Belang and for the PvdA, PTB in the Belgian case. So it seems to suggest that, they have thought of for themselves what is their main or preferred claim that they use with respect to a specific populist party. and then they propagate this on different types of social media. But of course, it could still be that they may have another strategy or another claim that they don't propagate anywhere. That is, of course, something that I cannot study because I only study the political communication. But if you look at the differentiation on different platforms, at least they tend to, for the Belgian case, use these arguments, and it's mostly the diet, so the link between the type of party and then the populist party they refer to, that seems to be decisive here. But that's a really good question, of course, to flesh out more in the future and pay more attention to. So thank you.
Nico, do you want to answer?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for your great question, Luca. And yes, we found that the left-wing parties are more responsive to the rise of the radical right with regard to the defense position. And we think that that's because the right-wing mainstream parties are already have a more assertive or the higher salience with regard to the defense policy and the position. But compared to the right-wing parties, left-wing parties have a lot of margin to change their position and the salience. So I hope that this is enough for your question, but we definitely have to develop more about, develop the theory more about this point. Thanks for that.
Good, thank you. Okay, thanks. I don't see any more questions. Robert, did you want to jump in or?
Sure. Again, please everybody in the audience use the chance to use the Q&A function if you have questions. But let me briefly jump in with one or two questions for both presenters. So thanks a lot for these presentations. I enjoyed them quite a lot. I was wondering, as regards Laura's paper, whether, if I understood correctly, you mostly focus on the party's official Twitter account, right? And so you do not scrutinize, for example, candidates or related organizations. And I wonder whether you would have more indirect statements on these accounts, right? Rather than the official account going out and say, oh, you can't govern with them, or you can govern with them, whether this is more nuanced at times. So for example, if I think of the case of Austria, you would have a lot of claims about you can govern with the FPÖ, but in the very indirect sense when it's about some form of persecution of what happened in the first ÖVP-FPÖ government, right? So I wonder whether you can pick this up or whether it is as obvious what such a direct claim would be like on the party's Twitter account. It would be interesting to see your thoughts on that. And the second thing related, and that actually holds for Miku as well, I wonder how much is it about populism and how much is it about thick ideology, right? And you elaborated a bit on this, that there is a certain sense of extremism that's related to the exclusion of parties. So can you tell us anything about the populist element of the exclusion of those parties beyond them being on the far right or far left? And for Mika, I was just curious. I'm usually all for causal inference in political science. In this specific application, I wonder a bit how many parties are there actually close to the cutoff point, right? Because your comparison is basically systems where parties just made it in or just didn't make it in, right? More or less, and depending on which of the models you use. So, and I wonder how many parties are there, how many cases are there? If I remember the paper by Tarek that you mentioned, I always had the impression that at least close to the cutoff, there are fairly few parties. Now, I'm just curious what this does. And I would also like to hear a bit more from you. What's the role of populism in this explanation? Or is this just right-wing parties coming in and therefore intensifying or increasing the salience of security-related matters? Or is there also an aspect of populism that's important here? Thanks.
Laura, do you want to start, or since your camera's on? I don't see Miko's camera.
Yes. Thank you, Robert, for those questions. So indeed, very good point regarding the analysis of the official party accounts mostly, and also of the party leaders. So indeed, in my study, I only focus on those accounts. That is because I first wanted to start with the official views, or analyze official views indeed of these parties regarding cooperation with populist parties. But it's indeed true that we know that there is some internal division as well, and that indeed studying a broader range of Twitter accounts could maybe lead to a more diffuse view on this, as we indeed also know that there can also be division internally within the party. So this is definitely the case, for instance, in various parties such as the VVD in the Netherlands, but also N-VA in Belgium. And that's something that I hope I can still address also within this new project that I'm talking about which is only about Vlaams Belang, because then, of course, it gets much more, because if you have to analyze all these tweets and also longitudinally, there'll be a large body of data, but it's the plan to also try to come to some sort of automatic coding of tweets. And if I can fine-tune that, I think this is something that will become maybe more possible, maybe not regarding the types of claims, but at least whether they want to rule or not. And in that way, get more insight indeed in how this may also be different between parties and between party members. So that's definitely a very good thing that I hope I can address, but it depends a bit on feasibility. Then regarding your question on populism, so is it more about populism rather than about thick ideology? Well, I think it's both, but it also differs a little bit between the countries and the context. And in that regard, I think that this comparative analysis between spanning these 4 countries or 5, 4 countries with 5 political contexts is interesting, because of course, the ideology indeed plays a role. So indeed, in general, it's mostly the radical right populist parties that are rejected more often, but also the ideology of the mainstream party is indeed relevant and telling in this regard, meaning that, for instance, also center-right parties are less likely to really use these policy-seeking claims to exclude populist parties if it's a right-wing populist party, so that the ideological distance plays a role. So in that regard, it's indeed also about thick ideology or not. But what you see in cases, and more specifically the cases which have this tradition with militant democracy being mostly Germany, but then also Belgium, so mostly Wallonia, a little bit lesser extent in Flanders, there you do see that many parties do really refer to the fact, it's an anti-establishment party, referring indeed to this anti-establishment element of populism, and that they also tend to treat, so there are certain parties mainstream parties that tend to treat left-wing and right-wing populist parties equally, because it's really related to this fact that they have this anti-establishment profile, or indeed have some sort of exclusion, and that is, but it's an irrelevant thing, but I think it's still both. So it's also about this populism, and you see this really when they use this office-seeking claim, for instance, where they say, but one specific part of an office-seeking claim is that they say, yes, because these populist parties, they are not serious themselves. They don't want to rule themselves. And that is an increasingly used argument, for instance. And that really relates more to that populist element of anti-elitism, etc. But indeed, the thick ideology, and indeed either far left or far right, definitely conditions this. They're more rejecting the far right populist parties, but these also tend to most popular parties, of course, in the countries that I study. So that's also a thing, of course, but I think it's both. Thanks.
Thank you. Would you like to answer, Miko?
Yes. So first of all, thank you very much for your question, Robert. And with regard to the observation number question, we actually have about 1,000 observation along the cutoff point if we use the manifesto data. But if we use the CHESS data, observation number is definitely decreasing, and it's going to be about 100 and something at the most. And in some cases, we only have 68 observations. And with regard to the populist elements, Thanks for raising the issue, because we actually didn't distinguish between the radical right parties and the radical right populist parties. So definitely we have to include the explanation of the populist elements. So thanks for that.
Oops, had to unmute. Okay, are there any other questions from the audience? If not, I can ask a couple of questions. I have a question for Laura. It's kind of more of a kind of a thought, but also a question, maybe also for an elaboration. So I was kind of when you were doing the presentation, I was thinking about sort of the tension between contamination and inclusion. So, you know, I mean, and you kind of touched it on the last slide. So you sort of, and you kind of almost answered it in your last comment. So you sort of measured it with ideological distance, I guess, because I'm wondering about that, right? Because I mean, you could have two expectations. You could almost imagine that as there's more contamination between mainstream and populists, that there would be more desire to include. But you could also think the other way around, right? That there's more contamination and there's more exclusion, but maybe exclusion based on other reasons. I mean, we see it a little bit in the Netherlands, right? I mean, this is anecdotal, but you could almost argue that there's been contamination with the VVD, especially in the last elections, but there's been, in some sense, an explicit exclusion based not on policy issues, but a little bit what you're saying on past performance. So I don't know, I'm just kind of wondering out loud, it's not really a question on the tension between that, because I think that could be something interesting to further look at. And then I mean, maybe for Miku, I'm kind of walking a little bit on dangerous territory here, because I'm not really that familiar with the models or the method that you've used. But I kind of wonder, when I was listening to your presentation, I was kind of wondering the extent to which you're able to take into account changing context in your models. And I'm wondering if another model might not be able to better deal with that. Because I'm thinking, you know, I mean, as I'm looking at what the policy positions that you're looking at, and I'm thinking of the time frame you're thinking about, there's a lot that's going on there. And I'm thinking that, you know, it could also be reversing the question that you're talking about, you know, how these parties are reacting, but it could almost be that the context is forcing the parties to react in a certain way. And I'm wondering, I mean, a bit of Luca's question, I mean, you're kind of your results finding, I agree with your answer, what you said, I think it's a decent answer, you know, why the left, but it could also be that there's changing contexts and that the left is reacting in a different way. So it's not so much that it's not the relationship between the parties, but it's that the context is producing a different reaction and you're picking up on that in some way.
Yes, thank you for your comment, Andre. And indeed, this contamination, inclusion, exclusion, I think it's something that I should shed more light on or should clarify. And I think I can clarify it more because, yeah, it's indeed, you have on the one hand, you have the general claim that parties use, but what I'm now also doing, like when I'm digging deeper into my data, is to also look, for instance, how does this evolve within a party over time and linked to what? Because indeed, the example that you use is very evident with VVD, for instance. So before, it was very interesting if the VVD excluded the PVV, they mostly did it regarding policy-based reasons. So they said, no, we don't want to rule with them because they're too extremism. But then, of course, they started negotiating after all, and then versus its government, which was formally supported by the PVV. And then, yeah, as we all know what happens, Wilders walked away. And then this granted actually the VVD with another opportunity to use another claim, namely the fact that they use this office-seeking argument, because they say, yeah, but we tried to work and cooperate with the PVV before, but they proved to be an unreliable partner. So indeed, there is something to be looked at. And of course, it's not possible, or I did not pay too much attention to this in this current presentation, but indeed, what happens in the political system, and indeed if these parties then support government or not. This also allows them to use different arguments, and that is indeed, you see it clearly with the VVD example, but I think you can also do this for these other countries, and in cases where you have less shifts in that regard, such as for instance in Germany, where they just don't enter into the government, of course, there you see that these claims are much more stable, also over time in general, but also within the parties. But if then something happens, like this case with the PVV, then this allows mainstream parties to adopt new claims. So that is something I think, or that I wish to flesh out more deeper, because I think that there is indeed much to still do there. But then, of course, you really need to look in the country and in the party and study that over time.
I mean, it's sorry not to interrupt, but I think it's really interesting what you're saying, because it's in some sense, you could almost argue, I think, that even though there might be a contamination and the parties might be moving closer together. And what the VVD is allowed to do then is not to get into the whole discussion about policy and about democracy and about inclusion. It's more of a balance issue, right? They're not trustworthy in government, and you can avoid the whole issue. So in some sense, it could be you could almost hypothesize that when there's more looking like the same, that they're going to use a different argument to exclude or something like that. Sorry. Anyway, I liked what you said. I jumped in. I turn it over to me.
Okay, so thank you very much for your question. And I agree that there's a lot of events going on between 1990 to 2019, especially like a security events, including the 9/11s and a series of wars. So for that reason, we actually added some covariates, like whether the country participate the war or not. So I think to some extent, we can control about that. And we also add the covariates about whether the party participate in the government or not, and some East European dummy variables to control for the different political culture. But yes, we thought that the RDD is very good because we can show that there's a clear causality here. But maybe we'd better to present it with other model specifications, because that can be more pronouncing for the results. Thanks for that.
Okay, cool, very good. Shall we close things off, Annika? We're on time, or is there one more? Yeah, or
I think we're really well on time, and okay. Since I also don't see any further questions, I think it leaves us to say a very big thank you to Laura and Miku for your fantastic presentations, and of course to those of you who asked questions for those stimulating questions and comments. And then it leaves me only to just remind you that our next session will be there we go. Our next session will be the last session of this season, and it will be in 2 weeks. And we'll have Guy Schumacher and Rodolfo Sarsfield to talk about their research on the psychology of populism, usual time, usual place, and we're of course looking forward to seeing you there again. And just to remind you again that we have the open call now for presentations in our next season. Go to our webpage, you'll find the submission webpage to put all of your information there, and the information we need from you is the title of your talk, an abstract, and a preference for which month you would like to deliver your talk. So we'll run it from March to June, and you can select as many or as few as you want, and we'll try our very best to accommodate that. And with that, and of course, if you have any questions about these submissions for the next season or the next season in general, feel free to get in contact. And with that, thank you again. Thank you everybody for joining in. Have a wonderful rest of your Monday and a wonderful rest of your week, and see you in 2 weeks.